By the late 1970s, two formal excavations and multiple amateur and pot hunting digs had left the Player/Winfield Mounds utterly dismantled and almost unrecognizable. The DU1 mound was all but leveled, while DU2 and DU3 had suffered significant pitting. And although preliminary and draft reports existed for the two formal excavations from the 1930s and 1970s, no scientific paper had ever been published on the site.
Then in the mid-1980s, Doug Kullen, then a graduate student at the University of Chicago, began looking into the Winfield Mound site anew. Being a student of anthropology and archaeology, and of Midwestern Native American sites in particular, Kullen was naturally drawn to the DU-33 site, a site which had yet to yield any published results. And like Jennings and Neumann before him, he wondered whether there was more to be learned.
But unlike his predecessors, he had no plans to dig the site. Kullen realized that any artifacts or information of value which may have been contained in the mounds were now long gone, decomposed, or destroyed. The site had yielded up most or all of the information that it had once held, and at considerable cost.
Kullen was then part of the rising generation of archaeologists who believed that excavations, being inherently destructive, should only be used when absolutely necessary and for answering specific questions, the exception being a salvage operation when a site may be subject to imminent destruction. And so instead of opening new excavations, Kullen intended to dig through the extant reports, materials, and artifacts stored away in the library stacks and storage vaults of the institutions that had previously conducted excavations.
Since he was at the University of Chicago, Kullen had access to the 1931 Neumann report, which described the excavation of DU1, the northwesternmost earthwork of the Triad Mound Group. Regarding the 1970s excavations of DU33, several years had now passed, and the primary investigator, James Jennings, had left Wheaton College in the early 1980s and was no longer planning on publishing any scientific papers related to the site. So in the autumn of 1985, Wheaton College was happy to provide complete access of their excavation materials that were tucked away in a storage room to the site's newest investigator, Doug Kullen.
Kullen, by then also an employee of the Patrick engineering firm in Glen Ellen, Illinois, sifted through all the available materials and artifacts, and first decided to write a report on the potential for additional archaeological investigations at DU-33, submitting the report to the DuPage County Forest Preserve District in January of 1986 for their consideration. In this report, Kullen outlined the results and impacts of the previous digs, and then recommended that the Winfield Mound site be fully restored via thorough backfilling of all previously excavated areas, as well as reseeding so as to stabilize the ground surface. He also called for stricter controls on all future excavations within Forest Preserve properties, with greater scrutiny of excavation designs and purposes, and with oversight by third-party archaeologists.
The following year, on Saturday, October 17, 1987, while still a graduate student at the University of Chicago, Mr. Kullen presented a paper on the Winfield Mound site at the Midwest Archeological Conference in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, at the Park East Hotel, entitled Winfield Mounds and Village, Forgotten Excavations in Northeast Illinois. Here, for the first time in a public forum within the archaeological community, Mr. Kullen laid out the results of the 1931 University of Chicago and the mid-1970s Wheaton College excavations, as well as what was known of the amateur digs from the 1920s. He credited the University of Chicago with initially surveying and describing the Player Mound Group, with identifying at least one of its critical functions as being for burial, and for providing an initial, albeit rough, date of pre-European contact. For the Wheaton College excavations, Mr. Kullen credited them with finding and establishing the location of the prehistoric village site along the western bluffs of the DuPage River, defining the aerial extents of the village, refining the date range of the site as being middle to late woodland, and with training potential new archaeologists with their field school operation. He also observed that both the University of Chicago dig of DU1 and the Wheaton College dig of DU2 established soil stratigraphies for the player mound group. Kullen's analysis of the ceramics, the pottery sherds, and the lithics, flakes, projectile points, and tools, generally coincided with the Wheaton College assessment. He placed the ceramic finds as primarily being in two periods: the Havana style, with strong dentate patterns, fitting nicely in the Middle Woodland period, and the collardware style, which fits into the Late Woodland or early Mississippian timeframes. We saw examples of both of these ceramic types during Peter Geraci's overview of the village site artifacts in Part 3 of this series. Dating of the stone tools also aligned with this analysis, with both Middle Woodland and Late Woodland examples being present.
But Kullen then went a step further. He noticed that if you tabulated the location of all of the artifacts within the occupation zone area, a general pattern emerged. Most of the Middle Woodland artifacts came from the northern half of the village site, while most of the Late Woodland pieces were found in the southern half of the village site. Kullen also firmly placed the Triad Mound group within the effigy mound tradition, due to their construction, the bundle burial, and the lack of grave goods. And given the dating of the Madison projectile points found within the village site, which we saw in the third video of the series, Kullen put the Late Woodland occupation and the mound construction of the site as likely between 800 CE and 1100 CE.
Interestingly, Kullen also observed that this Middle Woodland settlement was on the northernmost fringes of this culture, which was centered in the Illinois River Valley, more than 150 miles to the southwest, while the Late Woodland settlement would have been on the southernmost borders of the effigy mound tradition, which was centered to the north in Wisconsin and east Minnesota. The Winfield Mounds site can therefore be seen as being a remote outpost, pushing the boundaries further north or south, as the case may be, for the dominant cultures of the region. But these cultures were separated by hundreds of years. Within 2 years, Kullen's analysis and paper were published in the September 1989 edition of the Wisconsin Archeologist, a preeminent and long-standing U.S. archaeology journal. And so 58 years after the University of Chicago excavation, and 13 years after the Wheaton College dig, the results of these former projects finally became fully known and recognized within the archaeological community, providing valuable data for anthropologists attempting to understand the dynamic cultural traditions of prehistoric Midwestern North America.
Now, some might ask why publishing a paper in a well-respected journal is so important. Aren't the reports authored by Neumann and Hoagland good enough? Why should this matter? There are at least 2 good reasons why it does matter. First, it makes the information available to a much wider audience than informal reports tucked away in the corner of an institution. Indices for well-respected journals are widely available and thereby easy to search by the researcher or by the public. Second, and perhaps most importantly, publishing in a peer-reviewed journal is ultimately how science works, or at least how it's supposed to work. By publishing in a respected journal, it means that your paper has been filtered and corrected by a jury of your peers, people who sometimes have more expertise than you, or who might rightfully challenge you on speculation, unsubstantiated assertions, or incorrect methods. And so it gives the reader the assurance that what they're reading is factual and backed by solid evidence and methods, versus, say, reading a blog or, dare we say it, watching a YouTube video.
Meanwhile, the Mound site remained badly scarred by decades of excavations, a random pile of ancient and modern earthworks tucked away deep within the woods of the Winfield Mounds Forest Preserve, overtaken by considerable forest undergrowth. In fact, the undergrowth was so heavy, the remaining earthworks were often difficult to find. Even though the mounds were just 100 yards or so due west of the river, it was relatively easy for adventurous and interested parties to get quickly disoriented in attempting to find them. And there were interested parties, people who were naturally curious about this ancient site nestled within what had become a well-populated suburban area.
And so, in the early 1990s, Doug Kullen began giving guided tours of the Mound site, usually once per year in the autumn. These were popular tours, as many people were eager to find and witness the mounds deep in the forest, as well as to learn about the people who built them. These tours greatly helped to familiarize the local community with this mound group and village site, as to their ancient heritage, their singular nature within the region, and the need to protect and preserve them. The tours were so popular that the DuPage County Forest Preserve took them up in the late 1990s, and to this day, tours of the mounds draw significant interest.
And it was at about this time, in the mid to late 1990s, that an old companion in the landscape reemerged to help transition the mound site towards its next stage of life and much-needed healing. But before getting too far ahead of ourselves, we'll let Doug Kullen finish the story, as he played a critical role in the restoration process. We were very fortunate to meet up with Doug at the Winfield Mounds in October of 2020, where, while following COVID-19 social distancing practices, we discussed his role in documenting DU-33, restoring the mound site, and other topics.
Hello, we're here at the Winfield Mounds site at the DuPage County Forest Preserve in Winfield, Illinois. And today we're honored and privileged to have with us Mr. Doug Kullen, who is the archaeologist that first brought this site's attention to the archaeological community at large. He also brought this to the public's attention with a series of tours in the 1990s, which ultimately led to the restoral of the mound site around 1999. First, thank you very much for being here today.
It's my pleasure.
And perhaps you could just give a quick overview, a quick background of yourself for the audience.
Well, I'm a professional archaeologist, which means I do archaeology for a living. My academic background is went to college up at Northern Illinois University up in DeKalb, where I majored in anthropology and got interested in archaeology there. Archaeology being one of the 4 branches of anthropology. I went on to do my graduate work at the University of Chicago, downtown in the city, where I got my master's degree and finished my coursework towards PhD down there. I initially started off my career out west in the Rocky Mountain region and worked out there for about 4 or 5 years, but then I decided to come back to Illinois. I'm a DuPage County boy, born and raised in Downers Grove, and growing up, I realized that, we always heard about the Indians as being somewhere else, as being mostly out west. But as I learned more about North American prehistory, I realized, hey, there were Indians here in Illinois too, and for quite a long time. But nobody had really done any systematic research on what the prehistory of the DuPage area was like, and so I kind of settled on that as a dissertation topic. But in the meantime, I had to make a living, so I've been doing what's called contract archaeology, that is archaeological investigations in advance of construction projects. And that work has mainly been in Northern Illinois, but also all across the Midwest, and I've done archaeological surveys and excavated sites from Lake Huron west all the way to Utah, and I've even done some work up on the north coast of Alaska as well. So, and I've been at it for about 40 years now. So, and still going strong.
What first brought the Winfield Mounds to your attention then? Was it during your dissertation research? Yeah,
as I was developing my research topic, and I came back here to Illinois, I was trying to study some of the sites that had been known in the DuPage River Valley, and of course, having been a resident here and a visitor to the forest preserves, this place always jumped out at me. Winfield Mounds Forest Preserve. It's like, what are these mounds all about? And so I did some background research and found out that there actually had been some archaeological investigations here in the past, and so that's kind of what sparked my interest.
What do you suppose attracted Native Americans to this general area and to this site?
The presence of the West Branch of DuPage River over there. I think that's undoubtedly was the transportation conduit that brought people into the area. The evidence for that is that there's a habitation site, a place where people actually lived, is right on the little bluff there above the river. So they were definitely river oriented. And amongst at least the people that lived here earlier, the kind of pottery that they left behind is typical geographically of an area further to the south, lower down in the DuPage River Valley and in the Des Plaines River Valley, and really the Illinois River Valley in general is where that kind of pottery tends to be. And this site is at the northern periphery of the distribution of that pottery type. So it seems like people were probably, on a seasonal basis, coming up that river system up from the Illinois, Des Plaines and DuPage, coming up here, spending a little time up here, and then probably heading back down south.
Is there a direct connection or correlation between the settlement site and these mounds, or is it just supposed because they're here and the settlement's there that most likely those people buried their dead here?
Well, the geographical proximity of the habitation site and the mounds is really telling, I think. And the thing is that prehistoric people didn't just build their burial mounds anywhere. So it would be really unusual. I can't even think of a single instance where you would have burial mounds but not a habitation site nearby. So there's that. But as to which time period was involved, that's a little bit more speculative. Although the other pottery type that occurs in that was found in the habitation area dates to a later part of prehistory. It's called the late woodland period. And also during the late woodland period in this part of Illinois, we see evidence of a culture that's a late woodland culture that's basically centered in southern Wisconsin, called the effigy mound culture. And up there they made all sorts of animal-shaped effigy mounds, animal-shaped in outline, which is how they got their name, or how archaeologists decided to give them that name. But they also, to a large degree, made a whole bunch more of geometrically shaped mounds, including just simple circular or cone-shaped mounds, like the ones that were found here at Winfield Mounds. All three were very simple cone-shaped mounds. So it seems likely that those were built by effigy mound people, and that associates then with that type of pottery that was found at the habitation site.
Would the people who were buried in these mounds, would they have died when the communities were camping here at this site, or would their remains possibly, would those people maybe have come here with the intention of burying the remains of their people? Or it's hard to say?
It's hard to say, especially because of the three mounds that were here, only one of them has actual documentation of a human burial in it. And I mean documented by trained archaeologists. So, and that was Mound 1, which was the biggest of the mounds. And it contained what was called a bundle burial. And the thing about bundle burials, that was a method of disposal of the dead that involved initially taking the dead body and leaving it out somewhere. Sometimes they'd be put up in a scaffold, up in a tree.
Exhumation. Yeah.
Well, they weren't actually buried initially. So the body was exposed so the flesh could rot away. And then at some point later on, the bones were collected up and tied up or wrapped up in a bundle, along with other items sometimes, but not always. And then that bundle was put into the ground. So that whole process probably would take more than one season and maybe multiple seasons, multiple years. So it's possible that, dead bodies were laid out here for initial stage of in the burial process, and then finally the mounds were constructed. And it's unfortunate because, you know, obviously if a skeleton's or a body's and a skeleton's been left out in the elements for a long time, it's going to start decomposing before it even gets into the ground. And I think that was mainly the case here at Winfield because of that. The one bundle burial that was found by the University of Chicago people back in 1931, it just crumbled to pieces as they tried to excavate it. So it was in such a bad state of deterioration. And there's really no telling how many other bundle burials or other kinds of burials might have been in these mounds, but if they were treated in the same fashion, they just completely decomposed and dissolved, and there was just no sign of them for archaeologists to find. And that is not unusual for effigy mounds, because a lot of work has been done up in southern Wisconsin at effigy mounds, and typically the burial mounds just don't have anything in them at all, or anything left to be found, because people at that time period tended to not place any objects in the graves with their dead. It was just the bones, and once the bones decompose, there's really not much left to be found.
So Doug, to switch over to the restoration, the site restoration just for a moment, how did that come about and what role did you play in that?
Well, I'm trying to remember because it was so long ago.
Yeah, it was over 20 years ago.
There was a push at the time by the committee that runs the Prairie Path. I think it was like a volunteer committee. And they were interested in promoting various attractions along the length of the Prairie Path Trail. And this was obviously one of them. And I think that, if I remember correctly, they invited me to come and I talked to them. And we suggested the project because at the time the mounds had been excavated over time, but none of the archaeologists had backfilled any of their excavations, and the mounds themselves looked pretty bad, just because there were gaping holes in them, and also they'd been really badly overgrown in buckthorn thicket, and you could barely even push your way through that to get to them. So in order to make them...
I remember that, by the way. I was here in the 95 to 2000 time frame multiple times, and it was a junkyard too. I mean, there was shopping carts here.
Yeah, there was some trash
mattress
and stuff. Yeah.
Broken liquor bottles and so on. It was pretty bad.
So in order to develop it into any kind of a spot where people would like to, at least we figured, would like to come and learn something about the mounds, we figured we needed to restore it and clean it up a bit. So we worked with the Forest Preserve District, obviously, because this is all their land, and they were more than happy to cooperate and to supply a lot of necessary manpower and stuff in terms of coming in and having the restoration crews take out the buckthorn, which was a major thing. And then I believe right after that, like a microburst came through here and knocked down a bunch of mature trees, and then they cleaned all that up. But I organized some of my fellow archaeologists in the area, and the Forest Preserve District supplied a big load of black dirt, and then we archaeologists hauled the dirt in. They brought it in from the other way over there, and we wheelbarrowed the dirt over, and we filled the mounds back.
Did that all by hand?
Right, all by hand, absolutely. And yeah, with just shovels and wheelbarrow and rakes and stuff, and we graded out the mounds and refilled the excavations and tried to get them back to approximately what they would have looked like before, because at least the dimensions had been recorded, back by University of Chicago people in 31. So we knew what the basal diameters were and the general height of each one of the three mounds. So we tried to get them back to looking like they should. So they have since become a little bit overgrown. This isn't as bad as I remember it being. There were a lot of thistles, like the first few years after the restoration was done.
Well, I remember coming here with the kids a few times after the restoration, it was like night and day, the difference. I mean, from when before, where it was not a place I even felt safe bringing the kids, to a place that you could actually see the mounds and appreciate them for what they were. So it was a dramatic difference.
And then working with the Forest Preserve District again, we put together these interpretive signs. That one actually, the artwork was done by my father.
Is that right?
Yeah, so I kind of leaned on him to provide a little artwork there. I sort of designed what I wanted it to look like, but he did the artistry, and then I worked on the text for this one, and I thought there was another one, but maybe not. Or it's that one that's on the main trail.
Oh, on the main trail.
And so I'm really pleased to see that still holding together after all these years.
Very well, yeah.
So.
Putting this site into a more general perspective, how does this site relate to some of the other archaeological sites in the area, Upper Illinois or even more local?
Yeah. In terms of importance, I'd say it's really up there, just because it's one of the few sites that's left preserved.
Yeah.
So much of the landscape in the Midwest has been opened for cultivation, and so when the plows go through, they turn the soil over. And in upland settings like this, at least, the archaeology isn't very deep at all. It's in the upper foot or 2 feet of soil, and over time, in areas that have been cultivated, those remains just get all churned around and battered up and moved around from side to side even. So finding sites archaeological sites where the artifacts are still more or less in position where they were dropped, 1,000, 2,000 years ago, is really something significant. Needs to be preserved. Looking more broadly at DuPage County, so few sites have really been investigated and reported on. Again, this site stands out. There's another site we were talking about before, the Kautz site. It's a little bit further upstream on the West Branch. I think has we call them archaeological components that date to the same time period as the two components here at Winfield Mounds. And I think it probably has other components as well there at Kautz. So it might be a similar site to here at Winfield, but as far as I know, it doesn't have any burial mounds associated with it. There are other burial mound sites known in the DuPage Valley, but they're further south, down at the confluence with the DuPage River, or with the Des Plaines River and the DuPage, not too far from Channahon. There are some pretty big mounds down there, and those are preserved, and they're on state land now. And then the further downstream you go, the bigger the village sites and the mound complexes become, going downstream on the Des Plaines and past the Kankakee River and into the Illinois drainage. You start getting sites that really could be called permanent villages, or at least seasonal villages, where people would stay there for the winter, and then in the summer they might come upstream in their canoes to sites like Winfield here, where they would just stay and maybe do some hunting and live through the summer and the early fall. And this time of year, especially, you would think they might be up here gathering hickory nuts and hunting deer before they packed up and went on further on south, back downstream.
As a professional archaeologist, how often do you see the situation like we saw here at the Winfield Mounds site, where there was unintended or intended vandalism that occurred and leaving the site in a very bad state of repair? How often do you see that sort of thing in archaeology?
Less and less, I guess you could say, because the archaeological record is a finite thing. You don't get more prehistoric sites. So they're just one by one falling by the wayside. Now, this part of Illinois never had many burial mounds to begin with, and most of them got pretty well destroyed in the 19th century and early 20th century, especially as the Chicago metropolitan area expanded outwards. But there are still a few mounds left here and there. But it's true that even in areas that are still more rural and downstream in the central Illinois River Valley and in places out way in northwestern Illinois along the Mississippi River that aren't anywhere near as developed as what we find here in DuPage County. A lot of the mounds have been pitted and looted over the years. So It's just a kind of a sad fact. In my work as a professional archaeologist, I really don't see that very often because there is now, and has been for probably 30 years, there's a state law that protects prehistoric burial mounds, even on private property, so that even private landowners, by state law, cannot just go and tear down a mound if they want to. So those are protected now.
What would be your advice, like, to the general lay person if they found an archaeological site, like a mound or potsherds, whatever, either on their property or while they were out hiking, and about? What should they do? Who should they notify about something like that?
Well, if you find anything like that in the forest preserves or at a public park, I would go to the Forest Preserve District and say, hey, I found this, because they are aware of the archaeological sites on their lands, or most of them. Or if it's a public park, I would go to the city or municipality involved and let them know what they found, what you found. On private property, I would probably go to the Illinois State Historic Preservation Office, and they're down in Springfield. I guess you can find them in the phone book or online. They definitely online through the Illinois Department of Natural Resources website. They're linked in through there. So they have professional archaeologists on staff, and they can consult and give advice as to what to do if you find an archaeological site.
Doug, is there anything new and exciting that you've been working on recently that you could potentially share with the general public, or?
Well, as part of my career, I've been doing archaeology professionally here in Northeast Illinois for, more than 30 years now. I was running my own consulting company for many, many years. But in the last 6 years, I've joined up with an engineering company called Burns & McDonnell, and it's a nationwide company, and we've been doing archaeology all over the Midwest. Right now, as we speak, I'm involved with a really big project down on the Ohio River. We've got two prehistoric sites on the floodplain that are buried about 6 feet below the surface, and we're finding a lot of artifacts at those sites. And a third site, a plantation site, pre-Civil War plantation, right on the bluffs overlooking the Ohio River. So that's some exciting stuff, and that's what's going to keep me busy for the rest of this fall, and probably doing the analysis through the winter and everything.
So Doug, thank you very much for coming here today and answering our questions. It's been very informative, and we very much appreciate it.
Okay, well, happy to help.
Thank you.
Thanks to the work of George Neumann, James Jennings, Doug Kullen, and many others, we now have a fairly good understanding of the archaeology related to the Winfield Mounds. But the book is not yet closed on this ancient site. It still continues to draw much interest from the local community, as well as academia. As mentioned in previous videos, the village site artifacts are part of active research by the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee. New ideas and hypotheses continue to emerge in an attempt to fill in the blanks that exist related to Middle and Late Woodland archaeology and culture. For example, Peter Geraci of the University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee points out that the Winfield Mounds area was not only conducive to sustenance living with its river and rich natural resources, but it also has an unusual concentration of natural springs, from here to a few miles north and west, springs that may have been considered sacred by Native Americans. And this may have been another factor for the building of the effigy mounds at this location.
There were also lingering questions related to the previous excavations. Regarding DU3, the mound deeply pitted by pot hunters in 1927, was the anecdotal description of charred materials near the bottom of the pit a possible cremation burial? And was the bundle burial found in DU1 part of the original mound construction as indicated by Neumann, or was it perhaps an intrusive burial, added later by subsequent Native Americans, co-opting the ceremonial sacred site to honor their dead?
And so in the end, what do we actually know about this mound and village site and the peoples who lived here? Based on the work of dozens of archaeologists from the 1930s to the present day, we know that this site was the setting for a small to modest Native American settlement, perhaps permanent, but most likely seasonal, and at multiple points in time between 1,000 to 2,000 years ago. We know that the DuPage River was vital to them. They used it for fresh water as well as for transportation, primarily to the south and west. For food, they harvested hickory nuts and acorns within the hickory and oak forest. They hunted game in the forest margin and the marshlands. They made and used ceramic pottery. They obtained raw flint and chert resources, possibly by trading with neighbors to the south and west, or by their own foraging expeditions to these far-off places. And once obtained, they spent ample time fashioning tools and projectile points from this raw material. They lived in semi-permanent structures, likely similar to wigwams, relatively easy to build and easy to take down when the time came to move on. Treatment of their dead included excarnation, by exposing the corpse to the elements for a period of time, bundle burials, and possibly cremation. And finally, in their most recent settlements, approximately 1,000 years ago, they built effigy mounds, simple yet sublime monuments in the landscape, most likely for ceremony and ritual, but also certainly, too, as part of rituals for their dead.
Finally, we have learned that these settlements, whether in the middle woodland or late woodland, would have been something of a remote outpost, the borderland at the very edge of their culture and their nation. As such, the people that lived here were almost certainly tempered and hardened by the challenges of their life, but yet confident and unafraid of the unknown. Their ceremonial mounds and the ghost of their village still resides on the edge, the borderland, but now between two great cultures, the Native Americans who dwelt here for thousands of years, and the European culture which now envelops the site. It is our hope that this site continues to be protected and revered, not only to honor their lives and their dead, but also to serve as a perpetual meeting place between our two great nations, separated by millennia.